A lot of us are asking, you know, what did we learn from this, and how did we let people down, whether we're politicians, policymakers, financial types, business people. And I think there is a pattern of inattention to what I've come to call the distributional things that go on in major transitions like this. I mean, almost it's not as if they're never talked about, but they're never really acted on. And I think that if you add them all together, the elites of various kinds have been damaged by this in terms of their credibility and their intentions. You know, what is it they really care about? Specifically in economics, I think that there's several challenges that are going to have to be taken up by the next generation of really smart young people. And we're going to have to overcome, you know, the tendency in any environment and in any context to be conventional, you know, to keep doing the same thing. So item one is, it's clear, at least I think to a very large number of people, and I would certainly include myself in this group, that our understanding of the dynamics of the financial system is not complete in any sense. That doesn't mean we have to throw out every model we've ever had, but I think that we just do not account for financial systems, you know, evolutions, the tendency to build up systemic risk and to explode every now and then. Older people tend to defend, you know, the models that they've had. So that's one area where I think there's a recognized need. Second, economics, notwithstanding a few great names like Schumpeter, is not very good at least in the corpus of existing economic theory, at thinking about sort of big structural changes that aren't cyclical, that aren't repeating themselves. But that's clearly what we're living through, in part. It's not the whole story, but it's part of it. And we're not doing a good job of thinking about it. We're not doing a good job of anticipating what these impacts are going to be and try to position our recommendations of policies based on it. Developing countries are better than this. And the reason is that growth at these high-speed rates and structural change is almost the same thing. The economies don't grow at 10% a year by looking like they, you know, by not changing. You know, everything's changing, right? People are flowing from the countryside into cities, from traditional sectors into the modern economy. Cities are growing and urbanization is occurring. You know, the export sector is evolving, and then they hit the middle income transition where China is now, and start moving up the value-added chain, and a whole bunch of things die off. So developing countries get this notion that there's going to be structural change and that governments have an important role in supporting it. We in many ways are not very good at that in the advanced countries, and for understandable reasons we haven't had to be very good at it for much of the last 50 years. But if I'm right, that this is kind of a crossroads, this different point where the impact, the aggregate impact of the developing countries on the advanced ones is starting to change its character and get larger, then we're going to have to get better at it. So that'd be another area where I think we've got some real work to do in economics. And if you go back to the early post-war period, the lion's share of the recognized research that was done in economics was done in the United States or the United Kingdom. Now Europe is a major force, and that's just a natural evolution. There's a lot of smart people. The institutions got better and better. The German institutions were very good before the war, but they nearly destroyed them by driving people away, so they kind of had to rebuild them. I think some people know, but the American research university is built on a kind of variant of the German model. The first few of them, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and so on, graduated from being sort of funny little colleges to research universities, basically using the German model. Now I think we'll see the same thing in the developing countries as they get bigger and richer, and the training is excellent. Some of them will be trained in the advanced countries. Some of them increasingly will be trained where they are. One of the good things about that is they have a range of experience on which they base their thinking, which is different. And so it enriches the research enterprise. You know, when I escaped being an academic administrator in the late 90s, the internet was sort of arriving and being a major force on the way markets and things like markets worked informationally. And so I asked myself the question, well, is this going to produce a huge change? The answer to that was pretty obviously yes, even though at the time everybody overestimated the speed with which that would happen. The second question is, are the models okay? Meaning, do we already understand this basically? And I think the answer, people had different answers to that, but I think the answers were no. And the reason is, when you build a model in economics, you can't put everything in the world in it. It's too complicated. So you have to filter out the stuff that's not very interesting and keep the stuff that's essential. Well, what do you filter out? You filter out stuff that doesn't change. And that's fine. That's good model building. But then you have to rebuild the model if you filter out something that starts to change and it's important. So the developing countries bring a sense of things changing that is particularly relevant now, the structure, the structural impacts. And they're instinctively better at thinking about it than people whose sort of experience is different and maybe more like the experience we had for 50 years after World War II in the advanced countries. So on the whole, I think you're going to see a democratization of research, and it will be aided tremendously by information technology. Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, about a year ago introduced a major initiative which he called the democratization of research in development economics and policy. And he threw open the doors of the World Bank databases. And it's already starting to have an enormously powerful effect, because basically it's now easy to get at it. Anybody can get at it and test hypotheses and do what they want. And the internet makes that so easy. I think we're going to see an enormous sort of spreading out of research and interesting ideas. There's always this tension, at least in the academic world, between disciplines and depth on the one hand and sort of breadth on the other. I always kind of tried to push people toward the breadth. For a very simple reason, I always thought, even in your own discipline, some of the more interesting research ideas come from the boundaries, you know, where two different disciplines are sort of talking about the same thing, only it doesn't sound the same, because we have psychologists receiving the Nobel Prize in economics for really important work on how people actually behave, as opposed to, you know, what we assume they will do when we build the models. And I think in policy, you don't have the luxury of leaving out stuff because it isn't in some discipline. I mean, policy doesn't come neatly divided into economics, and I mean, we put names on it. It makes it sound like it's divided. There's social policy and economic policy, but when you look closely, they're all garbled up together. So I think you're actually seeing at least some kind of expansion of the boundary of disciplines that moves us to a more realistic view of seeing the world. Now, whether we'll kind of have one great big social science discipline at some point, I doubt it, but that's the direction of movement.